Din Djarin exhibits a consistent behavioral pattern when interacting with Grogu during moments involving significant decisions or situational conflict. Across The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett, his physical response involves diverting his helmet's angle away from the child at key decision points. This motion occurs before dialogue, before action, and before he commits to a choice. The pattern is identifiable, repeated, and measurable across multiple episodes. The earliest example appears in Season 1, when Din attempts to leave Grogu with the Frog family. Instead of looking directly at the child, Din angles his helmet downward and toward the environment. The cinematography emphasizes the turn by positioning Din in a medium shot where the helmet movement becomes the primary, visible action. The pattern is not incidental, as the child is positioned directly in Din's eyeline, yet Din rotates his head away at the precise moment the decision becomes final. A similar behavioral response occurs during the scene at the Jedi Seeing Stone. When Din acknowledges that Grogu may be taken by a Jedi, he does not face the child. Instead, he holds his helmet toward the horizon. The camera frames both characters in a wide shot, allowing clear visibility of Din's avoidance of direct visual orientation toward Grogu. The shot composition reinforces the contrast. Grogu is centered and still, while Din's helmet remains oriented away from him. This avoidance behavior is consistent even when other characters are present. When Ahsoka informs Din that Grogu should not be trained, Din again directs his helmet downward and away from the child. The shot isolates Din in a separate frame from Grogu, highlighting the physical orientation shift. This produces a repeatable, observable trait. Din's first instinct in moments of conflict is to reduce direct visual engagement with Grogu. The handoff to Luke Skywalker provides the most structurally significant demonstration of this pattern. Over multiple angles, Din avoids maintaining a fixed line of sight toward Grogu. The cinematography uses close-ups of the helmet to highlight micro-adjustments in direction. The head turns occur specifically at transition points, such as when Din prepares to release physical contact or when Luke initiates movement. This repetition indicates that the avoidance is consistently tied to decision-making transitions. Din's behavior can be traced to his indoctrination within Mandalorian covert culture. The Children of the Watch emphasize emotional restraint and strict adherence to protocol. This cultural framework relies heavily on controlled behavior, minimal expressive output, and suppression of personal vulnerability. Din's avoidance of direct gaze aligns with these learned behaviors. The episodes repeatedly show him maintaining rigid posture around others and limiting visible reactions. His gaze aversion around Grogu, therefore, reflects a broader pattern of controlled physical response. The consistent timing of the helmet movements suggests the behavior is not random, but tied to cognitive conflict. When Din faces choices that juxtapose personal connection with external obligation, the head turn typically occurs before he verbalizes the decision or before the narrative shifts to the next action beat. This creates a direct correlation between decision-making pressure and gaze aversion. The scenes frequently place Grogu in a central or foregrounded position, yet Din reorients his head in the opposite direction. Cinematically, the avoidance functions as a method of conveying character tension without facial expression. Din's helmet restricts traditional performance tools, so head angle becomes a primary indicator of internal conflict. Directors rely on brief, precise movements to communicate character intention. The shot framing often positions Grogu in a way that would facilitate direct visual engagement, but Din's intentional avoidance maintains visual asymmetry. This asymmetry becomes a recurring representation of cognitive strain. The avoidance pattern also appears in episodes where no immediate threat is present. When Din discusses Grogu's future training options, his helmet again shifts away momentarily before he speaks. This demonstrates that the behavior is not limited to moments of physical danger. It also emerges during discussions requiring decisions about Grogu's development or placement. The recurring helmet movement links these moments together across seasons. In the Book of Boba Fett, Din's gaze aversion appears during his interaction with the armourer when she presents him with Grogu's chainmail. Din handles the object while turning his helmet away, despite the fact that Grogu is absent from the scene. This demonstrates that the behaviour is associated not only with Grogu's physical presence, but with decisions concerning him. The action-reaction pairing reinforces the idea that Din's orientation shift is a conditioned response to cognitive conflict regarding the child. Spatial composition throughout the series supports this interpretation. Scenes involving difficult decisions are often framed with Din positioned slightly off-center, allowing the camera to capture his directional shifts clearly. Editors frequently cut to Grogu during the head turn, using the reaction shot to highlight the divergence in orientation. This structure makes the head turn functionally equivalent to an emotional cue in traditional film language. Din's avoidance behavior also aligns with his pattern of minimal verbal communication. When faced with complex decisions, he tends to reduce dialogue and rely on nonverbal actions. The head turn becomes part of this limited communicative repertoire. The lack of spoken justification in these scenes increases the analytical significance of the helmet movement, as it becomes the character's primary expressive mechanism. Grogu's framing consistently reinforces the contrast between the two characters. In scenes where Din turns away, Grogu often looks directly at him. The camera captures the child's static orientation, while Din rotates, emphasizing the discrepancy in engagement. This produces a visual hierarchy in which Grogu becomes the stable element of the scene and Din the variable one. The deliberate contrast clarifies the narrative function of Din's gaze aversion. The pattern persists even after Din is reunited with Grogu in later episodes. When Din considers his responsibilities to Mandalore, or the implications of taking Grogu on dangerous missions, he again redirects his helmet away during key moments. These instances occur even in relatively stable settings, indicating that the behavior is consistent across both high-stakes and low-stakes environments. The combination of visual repetition, cultural conditioning, and narrative context supports the conclusion that Din's gaze aversion is a stable character trait used to signal the intersection of obligation and connection. The behavior operates as a non-verbal marker of cognitive load, appearing precisely when the character is required to choose between conflicting priorities. The frequency and consistency of these movements make the pattern identifiable across the series. In all observable cases, the head turn functions as a cinematic tool for depicting Din's difficulty processing decisions involving Grogu. The action aligns with his cultural background, his limited verbal expressiveness, and the structural demands of filming a masked character. The resulting behavioral pattern provides a reliable indicator of decision-related conflict and serves as a recurring visual motif that defines Din's interactions with Grogu throughout the series. Din Djarin's repeated avoidance of direct gaze during difficult decisions involving Grogu can be examined as a behavioral mechanism linked to conflict management. Throughout The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett, his head-turn movements appear consistently when he experiences tension between competing priorities. These decisions typically involve balancing mission objectives, cultural obligations, or external pressures with the needs of the child. The resulting pattern suggests that gaze aversion functions as an adaptive behavior for regulating internal conflict. One of the clearest demonstrations of this appears during his interaction with Luke Skywalker in the Book of Boba Fett. When Din hands Grogu the Beskar shirt, the camera tracks his helmet movement as he repeatedly shifts his gaze away from the object. The scene positions the chainmail at the center of the frame, creating a focal point that Din does not directly engage with. His orientation produces a measurable avoidance response, suggesting an attempt to minimize visual contact with the symbolic representation of a decision he finds difficult. Din's pattern also emerges during conversations in which Grogu's long-term future is discussed. When Ahsoka informs Din that attachment between him and Grogu may hinder the child's Jedi development, Din does not respond by facing either individual directly. Instead, he redirects his helmet to a neutral space in the environment. This consistent avoidance of direct visual engagement indicates a deliberate effort to reduce emotional interference during decision formation. The detachment aligns with strategies used by individuals who prioritize procedural reasoning over effective cues. The Mandalorian Creed further contextualizes this behavior. Din was raised in a group that prioritizes discipline, restraint, and adherence to codified norms. The covert teaches members to maintain controlled posture and minimal external expression. Within this framework, gaze aversion becomes a functional method for processing conflicting obligations without violating behavioral expectations. Din's training required suppression of emotional cues, and his head-turn pattern fits within this broader model of reduced expressivity. The framing of scenes reinforces the consistency of this pattern. Directors frequently position Grogu in a stable orientation within the frame, while Din's helmet shifts away. This approach allows the audience to identify Din's internal conflict through a visible physical cue, even without access to facial expression. The cinematographic decision to highlight this behavior demonstrates its narrative importance. The structured contrast between Grogu's orientation and Din's movement makes the head turn analytically important rather than incidental. Din's behavioral response is also reinforced by the structure of his interactions with authority figures. When the armorer questions his alignment with Mandalorian doctrine, Din responds to references about Grogu with downward head motion. Although the child is not present, the shift occurs at the moment Grogu is mentioned, indicating that the avoidance behavior is activated by the conceptual presence of the decision, rather than by direct visual contact with the child. This expands the pattern's scope beyond moments of direct interaction. In situations involving risk assessment, Din's head turn appears as a preparatory gesture. Before deciding whether to engage in combat or reposition Grogu during dangerous encounters, he briefly angles his helmet away. These micro-movements often precede tactical decisions. For example, during the confrontation on Navarro, when Din considers withdrawing Grogu from a hostile situation, his helmet angle shifts before his hands move. This pairing of motion suggests that gaze aversion functions as a cognitive reset mechanism. The head turn pattern is also linked to Din's reliance on procedural thinking. Throughout the series, Din demonstrates a preference for concrete tasks and mission structures. When confronted with ambiguous decisions involving Grogu, the lack of a clear procedural guideline results in visible hesitation. The avoidance of direct gaze correlates with this uncertainty. Din frequently turns his helmet away during moments lacking clear solutions, indicating that gaze aversion marks situations outside his established decision-making framework. In sequences involving emotional conflict, directors use Din's head movement to substitute for facial expression. For example, during the handoff to Luke, the close-up shots highlight the helmet's angular shifts as a stand-in for emotional display. Since Din cannot convey reaction through micro-expressions, the head turn becomes the closest available analogue. The consistency of these movements across multiple directors and episodes indicates its institutionalization as a character trait. Grogu's reactions in these scenes provide further insight. When Din turns away, Grogu frequently faces him directly, creating a visual imbalance. This contrast suggests that Din's avoidance is not reciprocal, but unidirectional. The child seeks orientation and connection, while Din responds by turning away during high-stakes decision points. The asymmetry supports the interpretation that Din's behavior stems from internal conflict rather than mutual disengagement. The avoidance pattern becomes even more pronounced in Season 2, where Din encounters competing identities: bounty hunter, Mandalorian loyalist, and guardian. Each identity introduces distinct obligations, and Grogu becomes the focal point around which these obligations conflict. When Din faces decisions involving choosing between creed and caregiving, the head turn consistently appears. This repetition strengthens the conclusion that the movement is linked to cognitive dissonance rather than situational coincidence. Din's tendency to look away also functions as a method for maintaining role separation. As a Mandalorian, he adheres to a structured code. As Grogu's protector, he forms an attachment that contradicts several aspects of that code. Gaze aversion becomes a way to maintain these two identities simultaneously. By avoiding direct orientation during decision points, Din reduces the immediate perceptual impact of the conflict between role expectations. Camera placement throughout the series emphasizes this behavior. Scenes involving Grogu's departure, training, or future consistently feature slow tracking shots or static framings that highlight Din's head movements. Editors reinforce the moment by cutting to Grogu's neutral expression, making the contrast explicit. These repeated stylistic choices demonstrate that the head turn behavior is integrated into the visual grammar of Din's character arc. Across the series, Din's repeated gaze aversion during decisions involving Grogu functions as a reliable behavioral marker of internal conflict. The movement appears in episodes directed by multiple creative teams, indicating intentional continuity rather than accidental variation. Combined with cultural conditioning, role conflict, and nonverbal cinematic cues, the pattern forms a cohesive framework for interpreting Din's internal decision processes. In conclusion, Din's tendency to look away during difficult decisions involving Grogu is a stable, repeated behaviour that serves as a mechanism for managing internal conflict. It reflects his upbringing within a restrictive cultural code, his limited emotional expressivity within the constraints of his armour, and his struggle to navigate competing obligations. The recurring head-turn pattern offers a consistent non-verbal indicator of decision-making tension and remains one of the defining behavioural features of his character across all relevant episodes.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.